Hello, everyone. It's Steve with Aptera Owners Club. So I'm trying to shy away from any politics on this channel, but once in a while it is relevant and kind of interesting. And I think tariffs are one of these kind of interesting things to talk about. So, as we all know, President Trump has been elected as the next president of the United States. And one of the things that he really campaigned on was the use of tariffs. And he was a big proponent of tariffs during his first administration. And so, what he's promised this time is to impose steep new taxes on trade, including a 10 to 20% tariff on all imports, at least a 60% tariff on Chinese imports, and a 25 to 100% tariff on Mexican imports. And then the funny thing is that if you look at, so this is from the Tax Foundation. The Tax Foundation is a conservative, center-right taxation and fiscal responsibility think tank. And so this is their report. And most economists, almost all economists, universally agree that tariffs are bad and that impeding global trade is generally a bad thing overall. So what is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imported goods applied at the border when a business or a person in the U.S. purchases a good from abroad. Tariffs increase the price of foreign produced goods, incentivizing customers to switch to domestically produced goods and providing domestic producers room to increase their prices. The benefits that domestic producers receive, i.e. higher prices and sales, come at the expense of consumers, including business consumers. For this reason, tariffs are redistributive, taking income from some and giving it to protected businesses. So a lot of people feel like misunderstand tariffs and think that the tariffs are paid by the foreign producers. For example, if we put a 100% tariff on BYD cars, people are under the impression that BYD is paying these tariffs. That is not the case. The entity that's paying the tariffs is the entity that is importing the BYD cars. So, for example, if I wanted to start a dealership in the United States and import these cars, I would be the one paying the tariff. And then if, like, let's say the car was $30,000 and it's 100% tariff, I'm going to pay $30,000 in tariffs and $30,000 to BYD. And therefore, I have spent $60,000 on this vehicle. And then, of course, as a business person, I'm going to have to sell it for more than $60,000 to my customer, or else I'm losing money. So that's how it works. The business that's doing the importing pays a tariff to the U.S. government. It is not the foreign producer that pays to the U.S. government. So it is a domestic business or a U.S. citizen that is paying this tariff, which is essentially a tax. And as we'll go on later in this video, this was the first tax that was used by the United States in the 1700s. So while the protected business may grow because of the tariff, they are not low-cost producers. Thus, tariffs result in less efficient production, leading to reduced economic output and lower incomes over the long run. This is the standard analysis of tariffs going back to Adam Smith and the classical economists, who recommended keeping tariffs as low as possible. Tariffs were a primary source of government revenue back in Adam Smith's days. The debate has nuances, such as the potential impact of tariffs on the price level. Tariffs could have an inflationary impact or cause an economic downturn in the short run, depending on whether the Federal Reserve takes action to loosen policy and accommodate the tax increase. But no matter whether the short-term adjustment involves inflation or temporarily heightened unemployment, the long-term adjustment to tariffs involves lower incomes and production. So this same tax foundation basically has a little tracker where they track the economic impact of the Trump-Biden tariffs. They're calling it the Trump-Biden tariffs because Trump enacted the tariffs in his first administration, and the Biden administration kept most of the tariffs in place. And then in May of 2024, they announced additional tariffs. So the Biden administration actually probably had more tariffs than the Trump administration. So they're both equally guilty of this thing. And so they have basically it's a tax increase And this tax, again, is borne by U.S. Companies that are importing the goods and ultimately by the U.S. consumer. It is not paid for by the foreign producer. That's very important to keep in mind. So that's a tax increase of $80 billion, and long run GDP is down by 0.2%, capital investment down by 0.1%, and long time a loss of 142,000 full time equivalent jobs. Now, they said candidate Trump has proposed significant tariff hikes. His proposed tariffs would increase taxes by another 524 billion annually. So it's currently 80 billion. He would increase it by another 520 billion, so a total of 600 billion dollars in additional taxes. And then significantly, the projection is that long-term GDP, capital stock, and job losses will be significantly more than this. So the Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank, and they had this article about tariffs in early American history. And basically, they say economists from across the political spectrum have agreed on one area of policy: the removal of barriers to international trade. This consensus has guided the global embrace of trade liberalization between World War II and the present, coinciding with historically unprecedented levels of economic growth. So it's kind of, most economists, almost all economists universally agree that free trade is a good thing. And that's because it allows countries to focus on the things they're good at and not waste their time on things they are not good at. For example, America is not a great place to grow bananas. But let's say that we put a huge tariff on bananas. And so we put 1,000% tariff on bananas. At that point, it becomes economically feasible for farmers in America to grow bananas. Now, we're not a very good place to grow bananas, but if you build greenhouses and things like that, you could grow bananas in America. And so that's what it would do. And then, someplace like, Costa Rica, where they grow bananas, but they have a harder time growing wheat. They would be trying to grow wheat in Costa Rica, and we'd be trying to grow bananas in Kansas. And that just doesn't make sense when, bananas grow well in Central America, so they could trade it to us, and then wheat grows well in Kansas, and we could trade it to them. And so each country is doing what they're best suited at. So that generally tends to increase efficiency and make things better. The other benefit of more trade is that it links countries economically together, and therefore they're less likely to enter into war with each other if going to war with another country hurts their own country economically because they're trade partners. That's not true. They can still go to war, but it's one more barrier to them going to war. Now, lately, because there's been more political strife in the world, and there have been more wars recently, unfortunately, it does seem like some protectionist policies are becoming more popular, because one of the downsides of having free trade is that it is possible that your country loses its technical know-how in some important areas that may be important economically as well as militarily. Like if your country stops building airplanes and you just don't know how to make airplanes anymore, then that may not be good for you. Or you don't know how to refine steel anymore. Those things are not good for you. So there is some advantage or some necessity to keep some level of technical know-how and expertise in critical portions of the economy. And so I think that's one of the things driving these. It's a pretty recent thing to have these protectionist policies become popular, both politically and throughout the population. The people believe that this will revitalize American manufacturing and things like this. And in some respects, it can do that. But in the long term, you can use protectionist policies like tariffs to protect your industries while they grow. But in the long term, you need to have an industry that can compete on equal footing globally. They can't just survive because they are protected by tariffs. Okay, so anyways, just to let you know that this is not another just people talking badly about Trump's policies or conservative policies. This is Americans for Tax Reform, which is probably one of the most conservative organizations. They are against all taxes. Americans for Tax Reform opposes all tax increases as a matter of principle. They've had several articles over the past several years. Now is not the time for new tariffs and trade wars. New report estimates economic damage from tariffs. Global tariffs are counterproductive and will start civil war in the U.S. economy. This is Norquist, the founder of this Americans for Tax Reform. He sent a letter to Trump back in 2020 asking him to stop the tariffs. And as you know, that the tariffs started a little bit of a trade war. And that's the other thing, is that not only do these tariffs cause inefficiencies in domestic production because they don't have to compete as much, it can also lead to trade wars where we impose a tariff on countries and then they impose a tariff on us. Like usually they impose tariffs on our farmed goods and things like that, other things that we export. And then that leads to all kinds of problems. All right, so I found a good article on a brief history of tariffs in the United States. Basically, one of the first acts signed into law by the first Congress was the Tariff Act of 1789. This was the easiest way for them to collect revenue for the government, because back then they didn't have, it was a cash-based economy. You couldn't tell how much people were getting paid. It was very hard to know how much people were getting paid or how much revenue a merchant was generating, and then tax them accordingly. However, it was very easy to sit at a port and then see what was getting offloaded from ships and then charging a tariff to the importer. So that's what they did. And until the 19th century, tariffs provided as much as 95% of the revenue to the federal government. What happened was, if we go back to this Cato Institute thing, Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay were huge proponents of protectionist policies and tariffs back in the early part of U.S. history. And what happened is during that time when tariffs were the dominant revenue generation method of the U.S. government, what happened was there was significant lobbying and corruption to try to get more protectionist policies for their own industry. So shoemakers wanted more protectionist policy, and they would give a lot of bribes and things like that to try to get favorable tariffs to protect them. And that led to a lot of government corruption. That corruption associated with these protectionist tariff policies of the late 1900s directly led to the adoption of the 16th Amendment and a federal income tax as an alternative revenue system. So that's how the income tax kind of came into effect, because they were like, this is just generating too much corruption and lobbying and a lot of rent seeking. So they moved to having an income tax because they thought that would lead to less corruption and less bribery of government officials to try to get favorable tax policy for them. And then modern trade policy was restructured in 1938 to bypass the disastrous Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, which exacerbated the Great Depression. This Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 put up about a 20% tariff on all trade to Europe. And then this led to economic problems both in the United States and Europe, which may have led to a lot of the kind of radical and extremist fringe groups in Europe that indirectly led to World War II, or maybe more directly led to World War II. So this has been a problem for a long time. But anyway, let's go over through it. So demise of the tariffs. In the early 1900s, the adoption of the income tax and the tremendous industrial expansion undermined the historical justification of the tariff in two ways. The United States no longer needed tariffs to fund the U.S. government because now we have income tax. And two, the U.S. no longer need to protect its industry from foreign competitors because we were the dominant industrial power at that time. And then in the wake of the stock market crash of 1929, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Act. This sought to raise import duties by an average of 20%. The goal was to protect American farmers from the economic downturn brought on by the crash. European countries promptly retaliated with tariffs of their own. Overall, the tariffs caused trade between Europe and U.S. to decline by 2/3. So huge decline in trade. Although the exact economic impact of the tariffs is difficult to quantify and it's subject to debate, some observers argued that the tariffs contributed to European bank failures and exacerbated economic turmoil in the 1930s, thereby giving rise to extremist ideologies throughout Europe, which then leads to fascism and World War II. At the end of World War II, tariffs were decreased substantially. The U.S. went on to lead the formation of the General Trade Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was the precursor to the World Trade Organization, which sought to promote reduction of tariff barriers to world trade. The U.S. has continued to favor free trade and has generally disfavored tariffs in the years since. Free trade is defined as a policy to eliminate discrimination against imports and exports. Many economists argue that free trade is a net positive because allows countries to focus on economic activities in which they have a comparative advantage. Proponents of free trade argue that by allowing nations to specialize and rely on each other for products, there's a net positive benefits to all the nations. And in 1918, even with recent increase in tariffs, they represent only a small fraction of receipts by the Treasury. Okay, an interesting thing is something that maybe you guys know about or maybe don't know about is this is another article by the Cato Institute. Why are pickups so expensive? Blame the chicken tax. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the chicken tax, but basically what it was is in the 1960s, American farmers, in the 1960s, they discovered refrigeration and how to freeze things and how to ship things that are frozen. So American chicken farmers were freezing chickens and shipping them to Europe. And we could produce chickens much cheaper than European farmers could produce chickens. And we were basically kind of flooding their market with frozen chickens. And the European farmers lobbied their governments and said, hey, you guys need to protect us from these American chickens. And so they put a tariff on imported chickens. And then President Lyndon Johnson retaliated with what they called a chicken tax, which is a 25% tax on imported trucks. The tariff was originally aimed at vehicles made by Volkswagen in West Germany, even though the original issue over chickens has been long resolved and Germany no longer makes light trucks. The tariff remains in place out of political inertia. So we have this chicken tax that's been in the book since 1960, and that's why U.S. domestic automakers dominate the domestic market in light trucks. So Silverado, Sierra, Dodge Ram, Ford F-150s, F-250s, 350s, they account for 95% of light truck sales in the United States. And that's because of the chicken tax. You just can't, foreign producers just cannot compete when there's a 25% tariff on their things. They would have to be 25% better and more efficient than domestic producers to be even on the same footing. And that's why pickups are so expensive, according to the Cato Institute. And that's probably true. Most of the auto industry would like to get rid of the chicken tax, even the ones that benefit from it at this point, because the market's become so globalized. But I mean, I think this is just a funny, interesting fact that there's still this chicken tax that still remains in the books from the 1960s. Okay, now back to Aptera. We know that Aptera is mostly made of foreign parts and mostly European parts. So CPC Group, that's an Italian company. They're making the Bink pieces, the body panels. Sherry Automotive is doing a lot of that's a Chinese company. So this tariff could be 60 to 100%. And then CoStamp is doing the chassis and suspension. HSL Lighting, Maxion. Now Maxion, that's a domestic producer, so that shouldn't make a huge difference. Hirschler Automotive, that's a foreign company. CTNS, foreign company. Vitesco doing the drivetrain, that's a European company. Yazaki, that's a Japanese company. Panasonic, Japanese company. So the majority of Aptera parts are from producers in Europe, and then a few producers out of Asia. And then of course Sherry Automotive is a Chinese company. So this is their bill of materials. So they're thinking it's going to cost $30,000 in the bill of materials. If this bill of materials increases by 10%, you're talking about $3,000. That's if the tariffs are only 10%. If they're 20%, as has been promised, that's going to be $6,000. That's saying if 100% of their parts are foreign, which of course they are not. So $6,000 would be kind of on the upper end of things. Although a couple of parts are going to have 100% tariff, the parts from China. So that may push it closer to 60. So I think overall we're looking at, if these tariffs are enacted and they include, there's not any kind of carve out for like smaller importers like Aptera or something like that. We're looking at a couple of thousand to several $1,000s per vehicle in increased costs from these tariffs. So that is probably gonna, it's gonna have to either be passed on to the customer, or it's gonna result in lower gross margins. So Aptera is saying that they're gonna eventually reach 30% margins, which is a huge margin. And if they have 30% margins, it's gonna this is gonna drop their margins to 10% rather than 30%. Initially, they have negative 31% margins. That could be like negative 40 to 50% margins. So that could be bad. So we don't know. We still don't know if these tariffs are going to get enacted. They may or may not. It is possible that the Supreme Court could step in and say that this amount of tariff would have too much of a problem with the U.S. economy. They did stop Biden's executive order on student loans, and so they've kind of had a precedent that they can override executive action. So it's possible that the Supreme Court might be able to step in. Whether or not they will is a totally different question. And who knows whether this is going to be done by executive order or by congressional action. If it's by congressional action, then Supreme Court has kind of less of a chance of stopping that. Congressional action, if it's put into law, then it is the law of the land, unless it's deemed to be unconstitutional, which I don't think tariffs are unconstitutional. Okay, so that's where we're at. We're just going to have to wait and see how things go. But it is likely that if tariffs on imported goods go up, it is likely to increase the cost of doing business for Aptera, and likely this will be passed on in one form or the other to Aptera customers. And this is not just Aptera. This is going to be, our whole economy is very globalized at this point, and it's likely the cost of everything will go up a little bit. So I mean, that may, in some respects, for me personally, that's not such a bad thing, because I think you as Americans, we kind of overconsume items anyway, and so having increased costs might not be the worst thing. But in terms of economic growth and inflation, generally tariffs are thought to be a negative thing by most economists. Okay, well, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day.